There was an email from the Evergreen Fire Rescue Chief, so they get money for fuel reduction logging, replied to Commissioner Dahlkemper. The subject was forward FYI Eco Integrity Grant. Eco Integrity Alliance is my organization. The email said to Commissioner Dahlkemper, very good to see you yesterday morning. Some information you asked about yesterday is below. And you go to below and it says, per their website, Eco Integrity Alliance is pleased to announce the receipt of a grant from a foundation. And there are a couple links to our website where we announced our funding, which we're not doing anymore. So weird. Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, I'm going to give you a final update on my lawsuit against Jefferson County, Colorado Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper and Jefferson County, Colorado. If you're the type of person that needs to know the end of a story before reading the beginning and middle, by all means, go ahead and go to the end of this and find out the ending, although you're not really going to quite understand it if you don't get the whole story. So for those who are sticking with the story, I will do a brief, which will probably end up being not brief, recap of what this lawsuit has been all about, and then I will tell you about the judge's ruling. So I was living in Jefferson County, Colorado, and I had found out with my own eyes and brain that Jefferson County was doing some of the most aggressive, quote, wildfire fuel reduction, also known as wildfire pretense logging, that I'd ever seen on public lands anywhere across the country. It was quite alarming. There was no real way to interface with them. They would not talk to you, not respond to you. If they did, they would dismiss information. They would not allow any real public engagement. We would ask for advance notice about the logging projects. They refused to give it. It really culminated, and this is when I knew I had to leave Jefferson County, when I went to a tiny public meeting and I had brought photographs of some trees that were being cut, many of them up to 129 years old. Since then, we found trees up to 211 years old, but pretty darn big trees, debunking even their own false pretense of, oh, this is just for wildfire. We're going to cut out those smaller trees. They were cutting out some of the largest trees in the forest. So I brought these photographs to this meeting, presented it to Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper, Jefferson County Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper, and said, this needs to be explained. And what she said on the public record, on this public meeting, recorded and everything, was this wasn't happening.
Let me be very clear. We've talked with Jeffco Open Space. There are no old growth, 125-year plus trees that have been cut down.
And that was pretty darn alarming. And so I decided at that point, I got to get out of this county. There is just no democracy. Since then, we ended up doing our own public forum, got standing room only folks, a lot of engagement. Jefferson County has still continued to just stonewall. They may have scaled back a couple projects here and there, but for the most part, they're just taking all this free logging money, which they did tell us behind the scenes was sort of running out a little bit, maybe as a way to say, don't worry, the worst of this is over. I don't know. Anyway, that was what was going on, and we just had no understanding of how this government was operating without any science or public opinion, just making stuff up as they went along and then lying about it. And so there have been campaigns in Jefferson County. A lot of folks are still living there who are moving all of that forward. But what ended up happening was I was speaking to a media outlet that I used to freelance for, and I often contact them to let them know about logging and other things. And I was actually talking to them about something that had nothing to do with environmental issues. And in passing an email, this person who is an editor and who was my editor previously when I was freelancing said, so are you, well, I can read the actual email. How about that? What do you know? I have the actual email on hand. Okay, so it specifically said, by the way, did you present yourself as this media outlet reporter at some event in Jeffco, maybe on the tree issue? And I went on to respond saying, nope, why would I do that? I'm a very, I don't want to say prominent, but I'm a very vocal advocate for environmental issues. I was doing journalism. You can say I'm still doing journalism in some ways, but telling people I was working for a media outlet that I wasn't anymore, I mean, why would I even make that up? Like, what would be the benefit of that? And so this person said, well, Leslie Dahlkemper had said that. I was like, who did they say it to? And, some information was provided to me on that. And basically what was happening was, according to this person, Leslie Dahlkemper, this county commissioner, was telling media outlets that I was misrepresenting myself as a reporter for an entity that I did not work for, which is would be harmful to my professional reputation were I to do such a pointless thing. Again, what is the benefit of that? So we do have a lot of evidence of timber industry and other government entities really bristling at the idea of anyone from the scientific or conservation community speaking up about concerns for public lands. I mean, really, that's what it's come to. They're like, you can't even critique it. Media shouldn't cover it. We have all these emails, Forest Service saying that basically we're liars and they should never talk to us. And some media outlets have been like, well, my government's telling me not to cover this. I'm not going to cover these topics anymore. I've been told that by a reporter that I stopped covering these topics after the Forest Service contacted me. Fact. So when I heard this, I was a bit alarmed. Is Leslie Dahlkemper trying to damage my reputation so I can't speak on these issues? And I would be happy to have other people speak on these issues, which sometimes people are, but I end up saying the things that other people aren't saying, and I have a pretty good, 5-mile view. That's not the term. Whatever. I have a 30,000-foot view of things. So I decided I better find out what's going on if elected officials are talking shit about me to the media. So I did what's known as a CORA, which is Colorado Open Records Act filing. So this is like a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, but for Colorado. And I just put a few search terms, my name, Eco Integrity Alliance, a few different spellings, the website name, just a few basic stuff, thinking, all right, maybe there'd be a handful of emails, and maybe it would be this email. Over 700 hits. I think it was 739 hits of Jefferson County government talking about Eco Integrity Alliance and me. Weird, right? Weird obsession. And then we're like, I guess I have to pay $500 for these emails, which is what they ended up costing. So I got the emails, and a lot of what I found there is in a report called Forest Fire Malfeasance, which you can find at forestfiremalfeasance.org or coloradosmokescreen.org. You can find it there. Basically finding that there was collusion between not just Jefferson County, but other counties, state, federal, NGOs, timber industry to silence, censor the voices of those critiquing logging and to defame us. Like basically admissions to hide the science, don't admit to it, and all these things that are just things, about, it's just disinformation, anything. And it's like, while they are privately admitting it's not. So that's another topic. But anyway, what didn't come up were those emails talking about me to media, which was alarming. And here is something that gave me evidence that these emails simply just didn't exist, but were being deleted. And that was the fact that there were petition emails going to Commissioner Dahlkemper and the other commissioners about the logging, and they were trickling in on a regular basis from change.org. They would send the emails occasionally. And I had asked her, and I have the emails of this, years ago, whether she was getting the petition emails, and she replied in an email that she was. So we have that on the record, that she was getting petition emails, and yet that didn't come up in the CORA filing. So when we got those emails back, the petition emails that we know she was getting didn't come up, which I thought was kind of weird. Like, okay, the things that are not even that controversial, just emails on this topic, she deleted them. Now, the tricky part is sometimes you're allowed to delete emails as an elected official, and there's something called a retention period. But beyond that, if there is a filing for CORA and you're deleting emails, you have committed a crime. And that is what my understanding was of the situation, that these emails were trickling in. None of them came up. They had to have been deleted, including the ones she was getting after the CORA filing during the retention period. So just one of the things that came up in this case is the idea that even with these sunlight laws, elected officials still are seemingly legally allowed, it's debatable in some circumstances, so they can just delete any email that might make them look bad. And that's concerning to me, and I hope to you and to everyone. So anyway, so that petition thing was just evidence that emails were being deleted, that we know what the petition said. So did a second Colorado Open Records Act request for Dahlkemper's private email. Like, well, maybe she's talking about this work stuff on her private email. We can make that request if she's using it for government purposes. That came up, I think, with 2 emails or something that were just unrelated, which seemed odd because she is central on this issue and clearly has been bothering to talk to media about this and about me, and has been, all the media we've gotten on this, which has been a fair amount, she has had to defend the logging. So I'm sure she didn't like that. Did another CORA request for her email with just broad topic, fuel reduction, fuels, thinning, 0. At this point, it's like, okay, these emails definitely exist and they're being deleted. Are they allowed to delete it? Well, guess what? This is what the next step is. So we spoke to an organization that focuses on this, Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition, and they said, well, if there are emails out there that you want, your next step is filing a complaint, a civil complaint in Jefferson County. So that is what ended up happening. The other piece, though, that we were looking for specific emails to do with. So on October 3rd, 2024, why would you care about the date? There was an email from the Evergreen Fire Rescue Chief. So Evergreen is a town in Jefferson County, and the fire chief, they get money for fuel reduction logging, replied to Commissioner Dahlkemper. Somebody else in the department had done the research, sent this over. You could see it forwarded over to this fire chief. And the email from this fire chief to Leslie Dahlkemper said, so that it was FYI, the subject was forward FYI Eco Integrity Grant. Eco Integrity Alliance is my organization. The email said to Commissioner Dahlkemper, very good to see you yesterday morning. Some information you asked about yesterday is below. And you go to below and it says, per their website, Eco Integrity Alliance is pleased to announce the receipt of a grant from a foundation that I'm not going to mention because I don't want people to continue to go after our funding. And then they say, look at this site. They say their average grant is this amount, but not anything specific to this. And then there are a couple links to our website where we announced our funding, which we're not doing anymore. So weird. First of all, why would a county commissioner be asking a fire chief to investigate a tiny environmental group's funding, which happens to be the main critic of her logging? Why is there only what appears to be a response email to that? And why is there no reply? So we had every reason to believe that those emails existed, and they were not provided in the CORA. So that was part of the lawsuit as well, is where are the rest of these emails? And we know for a fact emails are being deleted. There are probably many, many, many other emails. We can't prove that, but we can prove deletion. We can prove partial emails, and we can prove that there was evidence that Dahlkemper had been talking to media outlets. So that's basically the gist of it without getting into the boring details. And here's something that I will admit at this point. I had been dealing with another legal situation, which I will discuss at another time. And that was where the focus had to be. And so I had engaged in the past in a small claims court situation. So I'm like, I can handle this. I didn't realize how complicated it would be. So what ended up being, I was outmatched by a team of 3 attorneys, or at least 2 attorneys and a paralegal at the county, Jefferson County. So I went through the process as best I could, doing research to understand it. I'm not going to get into all the details of everything, but here's what it ended up being. There were issues with delivery of documents. So first of all, basic questions that were being asked were not being answered, which was a problem in and of itself. But what was most egregious was I needed to amend a filing and to have certain evidence on the record so I could talk about it at this pre-hearing. I forget what it was called. And so I sent that in, I think 3 weeks in advance, maybe longer, make sure that was on the record, got that certified mail, sent that over, because I'm about an hour from the courthouse now in a different county. And then went before the judge, and then it's like, so yeah, talking about this stuff. And then he's like, oh, well, that's not in your complaint. I'm like, no, it's in the amended complaint. They're like, well, I don't have any amended complaint. I was like, I sent that to the court almost a month ago. And like, well, we don't have it. And so immediately derailed in that regard. I looked into it. What ended up happening was this. Jefferson County, which is the government that I'm suing, they're at the same building where the courthouse is, even though they have slightly different addresses. What I learned was that Jefferson County, the government that I was suing for withholding documents, was in charge of picking up the mail and delivering it to the courthouse. And that is what the county clerk told me upon my investigation of this. We had a U.S. Postal Service investigation of this, and they said these documents were delivered, and basically what happened was they were intercepted in some way, not delivered in time for the deadline. So when I went to the pre-hearing, they were not there. Now, yes, I probably should have checked to make sure that they were filed. I had checked to make sure that they were delivered, and they were, but I didn't think that there would be, I figured if you got a delivery, you got it. So the entity I was suing made it so the documents, either through negligence or malfeasance, didn't get to the court. And here's what's really interesting. A month later, they just randomly showed up. And I asked them, can you find out what happened? They refused to. I talked to everyone I could at the county. I even tried to get other entities involved for potential mail theft. No one was interested in investigating it. So, and the Postal Service said, we did our job, we delivered it. I don't know what's going on over there. So that's something, and I did report it to the state of Colorado Attorney General. They said they need multiple incidents, and then I'll tell you in a second, a multiple incident. But anyway, I had to refile that and get that all on the record. It really derailed things and was quite upsetting. Then what happened, there was another deadline. There were all these repeated deadlines for all these documents. I made sure, let me get it in, almost a week in advance. And certified mail, I spent more money. I got the tracking and everything like that. Sent it in 5 days before it got to the court. So again, after deadline, I asked them about it. Well, basically what happens is I had a signature component. They refused the mail and then didn't pick it up for another 4 days. So that's what's going on in Jefferson County. Maybe that's just ineptitude, but imagine you're suing somebody and they're the ones who get to decide whether those documents get to the court. So that's what goes on in Jefferson County, Colorado. That's an aside. So all of those pieces in place, moving things forward. There was this issue with burden of proof, whether or not the county had to prove that the documents they deleted potentially, or, well, some were proven deleted as in the petition, that those are legitimate, or whether the burden of proof was on me. The judge made a ruling that was a little confusing. It basically said we both had some burden of proof, whatever. So, all right, I'll spare you any more details, but long story, slightly less long, what I soon came to realize was this. If I persisted, Jefferson County did delete emails that they shouldn't have, as I believed. They could just keep saying that. There's nothing we could do to prove otherwise if they've deleted these and refused to look for them. So in other words, the judge could rule, yeah, these emails were deleted, find them, and they can just say, they never existed in the first place. I don't know what you're talking about, Judge. They could just stick to their story. That's all they had to do. And that would be it. And, because otherwise they dug themselves a pretty big hole. For them to admit otherwise would be a real problem for them. So was part of it. And then the other piece was the judge could say, these emails do exist. They could even say, so we did delete them. We're terrible. We're going to all resign and, make Josh king of the county, and all that stuff could happen. But the emails were deleted and I'm never going to get them anyway. So even if I won in this case, I would not get the information that I sought to prove that County Commissioner Dahlkemper and the county were defaming me to media and were, in order to silence me and prevent me from doing my work, and were also investigating my funding sources. For what purposes, I have no idea, other than to contact the funding source to tell them not to fund us. So I don't know what happened with that. I wanted to know. I realized that even if we won, it would just be a symbolic victory. And the truth of the matter was, there was so much time involved with this. It was so difficult. It was so onerous. I was spending almost every day working on this. And, I did consult with a few folks who said, yeah, you have a legitimate case, but you're probably, even if you win, you're not going to get anything out of this. And so I realized at that point I had to step aside on it. There's one other component of, that there is a situation in which if a judge rules that a case is frivolous, vexatious, or one other term, that you have to pay the attorney fees of the opposing party. So obviously I had clear evidence that emails existed and were being deleted. I had clear evidence that there were partial emails there that at least gave me reason to believe that there were other pieces of email, that I was being defamed to media outlets. That was via email, and I was looking for those. But at the same time, it just takes one judge to have one opinion that is not quite off, or maybe a little bit of bias, or maybe there is collusion between the judicial department and executive branch at Jefferson County. One is delivering the other's mail, and nothing happened when it didn't get there. So I didn't know the situation, but so I could have at the end of it just had to pay all these trumped up lawyer fees. I do want folks to know about that issue. I wasn't really concerned about that, other than, yes, there could have been some crazy miscarriage of justice. It could have been some legal wrangling to pretend that my stuff wasn't based on something completely legitimate, which it was. You look for emails, you don't get them, you file a civil complaint. That's what you do. But I want people to know how our system is so rigged. You're like, Josh, I already know it's rigged. That's why you were stupid to even file a lawsuit. Yeah, well, maybe I'm a little slow on the uptake and a little naive, and I still think that there might be some little shred of participatory democracy hiding somewhere under the leaf litter. But know that we have a system in which if you have evidence that there is malfeasance and you persist on that, and you aren't able to prove it, you might have to pay thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to government. So that is really alarming because it seems almost set up to prevent any real inquiry. Now, I think there should be penalties for people who are just doing things spitefully with no evidence. I just had a dream that there were emails. Like, okay, that's not cool. And there should be some version to protect against that waste of time. But this wasn't a waste of time. I wouldn't say most people who pursue any of this stuff are just making stuff up. So we do have a system where you will be punished for pursuing anything. But the truth of the matter was, I guess, what is the lesson I'm trying to learn here? I don't even know if there is a lesson. So comment if there is some moral at the end of this. What? You should have to spend tens of thousands of dollars on an attorney every time there is an issue? Like, sorry, but those of us working in the nonprofit field can't be throwing all our money at attorneys. I guess the issue is just that we don't currently have a system where you can work within the system to fix the system. And I'm not saying, oh, burn it down. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we have to find other ways. And yeah, I guess if you have tons of money lying around, you can do stuff like that. But otherwise, those of us who are doing grassroots advocacy, I don't think that we have much of an angle in these kinds of lawsuits. I think there's some other lawsuits for sure, like say around particular logging projects or whatever, but those are also very expensive. We end up spending most of our money to maybe beat back one small project, which I think needs to be done. I think that's necessary. But at Eco Integrity Alliance, we're trying to make a different use of our money. So money that goes into beating back maybe one logging project could be spent for a whole statewide campaign to prevent these sorts of logging projects from being proposed in the first place. So that's the way I'm thinking more and more, that I can't react to every little thing, or even big thing that's happening. If the government wants to talk shit about you and lie, they're probably going to be able to do that. The question is, can you circumvent that in some way? And I'm not sure of the answer. My take is that Jefferson County, Colorado is lost. Like, there's no democracy there anymore. If you live there, your forests are going to be destroyed, and you are very likely going to have some fast spreading fires because of that logging, and it may well result in not just property loss and financial loss, but loss of life. And that's a real bummer, and that's why I don't live in Jefferson County anymore, and that's why I still work with people who do live there to address this stuff. But I think what we have to do is we have to come up with our proactive approaches rather than always being reactive. And because otherwise we are spending all of our time in these fights that are just rigged. And the fact that even if I had won this case, and this is why I ended up signing a stipulation to drop the case, which would, because even if I won, I wouldn't get the information I was seeking. I wasn't interested in a symbolic victory. And that's basically what it came down to. So yeah, I will admit I bit off more than I could chew. I was a little bit arrogant thinking I could figure out this process, not realizing how many filings there were. And yeah, it's set up to make it so complicated that you have to be an attorney to really do it justice, so to speak, although not much justice here. And yeah, so you can say this was a draw. You can say this was a loss. Maybe it was a win in the fact that they know we're going to pursue this stuff. And, I know some media had been following it, but for the most part, they're covering things up as well, even though this directly impacts media that can't get government information. I mean, they should have been front and center on not just my particular case, but the idea of, hey, did you know that all the CORA-ing we do to government, if the government doesn't want us to see a lot of that stuff, they can just delete it. There are a few instances in which they can't, and I was alleging that these were one of the instances to do with public funding and policy making, etc. But they can just come up with excuses. They have their lawyers just working to defend them. And yeah, so for those who say, yeah, you got to stop working inside the system, I partly agree. I think we have to do all of the above. But yeah, the expensive lawsuit route for everything, I think you got to choose your battles for that. And so I have learned, but I will say for any of my opponents and opponents of Eco Integrity Alliance or opponents of those of us who are speaking for the earth, if you do come after us, we will defend ourselves. And in situations that are more egregious perhaps than my situation, I would have absolutely raised the funds for a professional attorney, as I did for this other situation that I'll talk about later. But yeah, so fighting the endless defensive fights, we're not going to win that way. Let's come up with better ways to circumvent the process, to get the public on board with a vision for what, say, public lands could be, biodiversity, watershed and climate refugia as a part of the global biodiversity framework to protect 30% of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems by 2030, which is a step along the way to the half Earth vision of protecting half of the world's ecosystems, both terrestrial, aquatic, oceanic, permanently protected as set aside for nature to operate its process. That is something I would far more rather focus my energy on than having to fight these endless fights. But I am a fighter. You come after us, we will defend ourselves. And that's what this comes down to. And that is the end of this story for now. Thanks for listening, and hope you can stay engaged with what we're doing. We need your voice. We need all of our voices more than ever.